Excuse me. That was a little shorter than I expected. All right, so we're continuing the Gospel of Luke. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. Chapter 16. All right, so we're in the connecting passages between two parables. The first one about the steward. You know, I used to think this was kind of the only example, or, you know, when I first, it's funny because I've been studying the Bible a few years and I never really thought much about this passage about the unjust steward. And he's literally called the unjust steward. And someone had brought the passage to the attention of a friend of mine, and the question arose, you know, well, what's it mean? And there was some interpretations they found. I forgot if it was online back then. You know, the internet was new, and I don't remember exactly whether or not. I wouldn't have looked it up online. I would have just referenced it probably maybe in a book, perhaps. I don't know. But I remember in the end, the analysis we took was that it was, you know, it seemed like he was being sarcastic, because it just the things he was saying were obviously not what he intended us to take away from the parable. I mean, the takeaways are things like, hey, be faithful. Be faithful in that which is least. Be unjust in that which was least. I mean, that's your lesson. And I thought, well, that's, you know, at the time, the comeback was, well, show me another example where Jesus was ever sarcastic or anything like sarcastic or used anything such as irony. And like I said, look at the previous chapter. When he says, there's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than over 99 just persons, because there's no 99 just persons to rejoice over. And we talked about it at length last week. You know, people say, well, what about Job? What about Noah? Both those men used sacrifices and such. They were sinners in need of repentance. That's how they were justified. That's how we're all justified. Because as everyone knows, we're all sinners. When it talks about just persons in the Bible, it's the people being just and perfect and such. It is in the sight of God, looking at them through the eyes of grace, not through an objective lens of material facts. You know what I mean? Did he or didn't he do it? Did they ever commit an offense? If you want to go down that road, we're all offenders. All of us. There's no one who hasn't offended in some way the standards of right and wrong of either God or their own heart. And probably both. Definitely both. So, you know, if we didn't know it was wrong, it probably wouldn't be wrong. Or we'd be at least, that'd be sufficient. You know, when you don't know what you're doing is wrong, like genuinely, not just like, oh, I didn't know it was illegal. No, I mean, you didn't know it was wrong. Different. When you don't know what you're doing is wrong, it's not an excuse for doing wrong, but it is a mitigating factor, which, you know, means you are more worthy of mercy. As Jesus himself said when he says, the servant that knew his master's will and did it not shall receive many stripes, but the servant who did not know his master's will shall receive few. And so that's a concept that's already been established by the Lord. And so I'm not like pulling this out of the thin air. So the connective tissue between the two parables. So what I'm saying, I want to point out that the use of irony and of parables where the meaning is not derived from sticking with the story. Meaning, the parable of the unjust steward is not for you to... The unjust steward isn't the main character of that parable that you're supposed to emulate or be like. You're not always supposed to be like anybody in a parable. A parable is a story, a fiction, which is crafted in such a way as to make a point. The subject of the parable of the unjust steward is justice, faithfulness. It's not, here's suggested behavior for you. go rip off your boss, and God will be happy with you because you'll be more popular with people. And then when you preach the gospel, they'll be more likely to listen because you, you're the guy who saved me all that money on my car insurance or whatever. By switching me to you know what. I don't. That's not the point of the parable. Like, oh, okay, go thou and do likewise. Sometimes that's the point of the parable. Like the Good Samaritan, go thou and do likewise. Though it's a little, there's more to it than simply that. Be a neighbor. Yeah, there is a go-to, and yeah, it's fine. So, anyway, so in this parable, there's not a go and do likewise type mentality you're going to take away from it of chapter 15, the parable of the unjust steward. Now we're in verse 15, I believe, right? Okay. They derided him. We looked into that, what that meant. And he said to them, ye are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. We did cover that slightly. But I wanted to keep it right here because that's part of what we're going into. Men want one thing, God another. And this is also a take on the previous parable. Like, oh, look at you ripped, wow, you sure are shrewd, unjust steward, his Lord said to him. And Jesus specifically says, for the children of this world are wiser in their generations than the children of light, or the children of the kingdom, whichever way he put it. They're wiser, because in this world you can be commended for doing things that God would hate. I mean, look at the world around you. I mean, currently, people are, for example, that gentleman in Chicago who faked being attacked and to blame it on some people a group that was, in opposition or whatever, that they had conflict. I'm not going to get all specific. You know what I'm talking about. Right? And he staged a fake attack on himself to basically what? For publicity, to get fame, and to actually being attacked like that would be virtuous. Some people still, some people find his, even like, you understand, the people he claimed attacked him, like the way they look at them, at those people, I'll call it those people, right? I'm one of those people. They look at those people and they say, that's the enemy. And any tactic you use against the enemy, this is what happens when you're godless and or you haven't taken your Christianity seriously. It's like, any tactic used against the enemy is acceptable. So lying, staging fake attacks, doing anything you can to frame them properly, quote unquote, to frame them as evil is admirable. There are some people who would still look at what he did and say, the only thing wrong is you got caught. And and so therefore you've committed the sin of stupidity, which is they don't admire. But they certainly admire the effort to smear and slander a group of people who had never attacked this man. Maybe not such a good example, since for some reason I don't want to get into names and stuff. I don't know. I just don't. I don't like to get too. This is biblical, right? But people will do things to hurt their enemies, their political enemies, their religious enemies, and I've seen it, like online, when people will, like, let's say I get in an argument with someone who disagrees with me, and he starts using dirty tactics, using straw men, insults, maybe attacking my family, right? The people who are on his side of the argument will still root for him, even though he's not being just, because they'll say, but he's owning the enemy. But he's making, he's really getting me good, or whatever, And people they will value and praise people for doing things that are not praiseworthy, for behaving in ways that should be considered unacceptable. And that's part of what the parable of the unjust steward is about unacceptable things in this world being accepted, but they're about things that are unacceptable to God being acceptable to man. That which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. And that right there is also a hyperbole. Because obviously, there are things that are highly esteemed among men that are abomination before God. But there's also everything in between. There's things that men think are okay that God thinks are abomination. There's things that men think are wonderful that God's like, that's not so great. All right? I mean, what I'm saying is, it's not all just because men think it's great, God thinks it's an abomination. What it's saying is, the esteem of men is no measure of God's esteem. And therefore, it's not esteem, opinion, whatever you want to say. The things that men have a high opinion of, the things that men find desirable, the things that men find, that is no measure of whether or not it has any value in the sight of God. Whether there's any truth value to it, like if you're talking about doctrine. When we talk about doctrine, just because a lot of people think it's right doesn't make it right. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. Now, that sounds like a little disjointed, doesn't it? Press, I believe, means like to force, right? Everyone wants to kind of push their way in. And let me use a figure of speech that I think would probably get a little more press. Probably just means press. I was thinking about the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force, but I believe that's another place. Similar verse, though, right? They press their way in. We have a figure of speech when we talk about shoehorn. What does it mean when you shoehorn something in? Now, we don't have shoehorns anymore. I remember my dad had one, right? And a lot of times he had these nice, hard leather dress shoes, right? And they were not easy to get your feet into. So they had this little special like slider thing you slid into the shoe, and it helped you guide your foot past that difficult part. The part where the back of the heel where you got to stick your fingers in sometimes to get your heel past it. So your shoe, the reason that's like that is so when you get your shoe on, it stays on. And it's nice and tight around the heel. Or snug anyways, right? So you have a shoehorn. Shoehorn helps you get, but it's a metaphor also for trying to get things in that don't quite fit. Or that aren't going in easily, don't go down easily. They don't necessarily, so even though a shoehorn is actually trying to get something that fits into something that should fit it, it became a metaphor for making things fit that don't fit. For shoving things in that don't belong in. Like if you're maybe like, let's say someone's got a foot that's too big for the pair of shoes. And they'll say, well, let's try to shoehorn my foot in. Maybe we can squeeze it in. And even the shoehorn won't get it in if it's too big sometimes. And that's part of the metaphor, like the idea that it's not going to fit. And that's why God esteems certain things. He holds them in high regard. Men, others. I was going to make references also to the weird things people do with marriage these days, but that's another example. People becoming heroes for exposing shameful things they do in private to public knowledge. Things that should be kept private are made public knowledge, and then these people are regarded as heroes. When I talk about It's funny. No, I'm not. Forget. I was going to say, when I talked, no one ever regarded me as a hero for exposing any of my sins. You know, which is, I think it's funny. Anyway, so people don't esteem the same things as God, but they still want to carry that all in. People want to carry their baggage into God's kingdom, so to speak. They want to press their way in on their terms. That's how this verse connects to that. See, the children of this world have a certain sense of justice. I want to make sure everything here just fits together, because this is not a disjointed group of verses. They're connected. So, the unjust steward is an example of someone who's trying to get into God's kingdom. Like, he sees himself, the standards of God sort of excluding him. The master, so he thinks of another way. Well, I'll do this, and this will get me into heaven, so to speak. They'll receive me into everlasting habitations. Notice carefully that Jesus talked about the idea of everlasting habitations in the previous parable. It's a metaphor for heaven. He says, I will forgive my master's debts and ingratiate myself to his debtors. Forgive my master's credits to his debtors. Sometimes it's hard to say. Debt and credit is like a funny thing to say. Anyways, so I'll forgive my master's debtors their debts, and thereby ingratiate myself to them. And then when my master relieves me of my service, I'll have people who owe me favors, and I'll have never-ending places to go. They'll be able to receive me into everlasting habitations. He uses that term. It's a strange thing for someone to say, but the idea is, it's a metaphor for the rewards of God. I will have eternal rewards. That would be a good thing. I'll have an eternal reward, an everlasting habitation, a house made in heaven, which wasteth not away. Right? But they can't give him that. Maybe in this world, if you had a master who had enough of a enough of a big enough, like you worked for one of the biggest banks in the country, and you send them all personal errors. I'm forgiving all your credit card debt. John Q. Smith, I'll see you in a few weeks because I'm about to lose my job. And like he sent out to millions of homes. You can maybe go eat dinner at a different person's house. Maybe even borrow $50 or whatever for the rest of your life. I don't know. But it's all going to come to an end eventually, right? So the law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. And that was the scripture. This is what the scripture was. We had the law and the prophets to John the Baptist. And now I'm here preaching the kingdom of God, and people are pushing their way in. And they're trying to come in their way. That's going to become apparent in the next thing. People want to come their way. They want to do things on their terms. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. The reason he's saying this now is because people want to come in. They want the law to be what it is for them. This is what it means to me. This is what the Bible means to me. This is what the Scripture means to me. And, in the New Testament, there is some cause for that, because we have, on certain matters where there are no laws and no guidance in the Scriptures, we have to turn to our conscience and the Holy Spirit for our understanding. And hopefully if we do turn to the Spirit in good conscience, he reveals us the truth and we accept it. It's funny, when I was going to start the study, I was like, oh boy, here we go into the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. I got my work cut out for me. But then I said a prayer to the Lord. I said, I want the truth. I want to know what's right. It doesn't matter to me if I've spent my lifetime on one particular doctrine. I want the Lord to reveal to me whatever, because I'm not building my kingdom. I'm trying to enter into his kingdom. If I build my kingdom here on earth, I'm going to have to get quite a big shoehorn to squeeze it into God's kingdom. Because God's kingdom, the law is what it is. And when you add to it, what you're left with, you're going to have to try to force your way into the kingdom. People are always trying to force things into God's, and it's, there's a lot of things, like there are questions for which we are given no answers. Someone asked me about the recent pandemic, or the coming pandemic, which may be a pandemic, with the coronavirus, right? Is this a sign of the end? I'm like, well, I don't know. It could be. If it is, it will be followed by other things. It's not just going to be this and then, the end. It's not like there's just one disease and then the end comes. This is not how it works. That's one of the things that you can always tell. Like the signs should follow each other, and then pretty soon the whole world knows something's up. It's not just business as usual. Anyways, people always kind of cram and shoehorn stuff in. A lot of it has to do with loopholes in the law. Remember I said, Paul, why do you make everything so complicated? And I say, I don't make things complicated. What happens is the truth is simple, but man complicates it, and therefore it requires a lot of explanation to account for all the things men have crammed in. Same thing with the law, because people say, well, what about this? What about that? We have this law. It says, thou shalt not. Okay, seems pretty simple. Well, what if this and that and the other, and how about this? And, and sometimes they're legit questions. Sometimes they're questions that are being asked so that someone can do something that they may know is wrong, but they want to know if it's technically wrong. Is it technically wrong? Is it illegal? Is it illegal? It can be wrong as wrong can be, but is it illegal? And that's what people often want to know. And that's always a sign of somebody who's careful when dealing with someone who only worries about whether something is technically illegal. Because there's a lot of bad and wrong that can be done in this world that's not technically illegal. And that is not, or even technically against the law of God, technically speaking. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. Tittle means it's debatable what tittle means. I read in my Bible, my companion Bible said it was this the ornamentation found in the Masra, the tagin and stuff, and I don't know, because from what I understand, the Masra is a later creation. I don't know, but obviously, even in English, it comes across as tidbit, you know what I mean? And so obviously it means the least aspect, right? It is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one aspect of the law. Why? Because the law is based on God's truth. You know what I mean? And therefore, how can it pass? Because truth transcends time and space. Heaven and earth is just time and space. The law is truth. Now, as far as the law, but Paul, you teach the law has passed away. I didn't say fail, but pass away, yes. For righteousness' sake, the law of Moses has passed away to be replaced, but it didn't pass away for the truth has not passed away. And that Christ fulfilled the law. He instituted a new law, a better law. And when you have a better law, it supersedes the old. It's a stricter law. It's not like, thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not look at a woman to lust after her. See, the old law passed away because the new law is more strict. And so the law hasn't failed in any sense like that. But it has, the old covenant and the old law is of no more effect. Certainly the carnal commandments. But that's a subject for another time. I do have a study on that, several studies. And on oraclesofgod.org, you can find it. And I'm going to mention it in passing just because when I make so bold a statement about the law passing, I don't know who may have heard, but it's like, I mean that in a very specific sense. It doesn't mean it's okay to kill or do anything that the law forbids. But it does mean certain things. So Notice he doesn't say it's impossible. He says it's just easier. How Christ abolished the commandments, number 28, right here. See that? Can that be seen? Okay, yeah. It takes an hour and 45 minutes to discuss the ways in which Christ has abolished the commandments, okay? So it's a significant subject. And if you don't agree, it's something you should listen to so you can at least understand what the arguments are. And thereby, I always listen to the arguments against the things I believe. I've listened to people say why they think this and that. That's where I got where I am today. A lot of times, though, I find I come up with a response, and I come up with I'll say, oh, here are all the arguments. I'll put the arguments together, and then I'll have and say, okay, here I've looked at the subject, and here's my blah, and they go back to, well, what about our first argument? It's like, well, I addressed that argument. Here we go. Let's address that argument. Okay, now I have these other. Well, what about the second argument? It's like we covered that one, but I have these 20 other things here that you have never looked at. You never looked at these 20 other things that contradict your arguments 1, 2, and 3. You got 1, 2, and 3. I've got 1 through 20. And it's like every time I get 1, 2, 3, and then I say, okay, can we go to arguments B on B side? No, we got to go back to argument 1 again. Because they insist that I must convince them first that their 3 arguments are wrong. I must convince, but it's like I have explanations for the 3 arguments, but I have 20 other arguments which give that explanation more weight. And if you don't consider those 20 other arguments, I don't know how we can have a discussion. And very frequently, that's what I feel like I'm left with. I go through all the effort, and I find that people are not willing to go on because they have their point of view, and that's what they want to stick with. Okay, continuing. Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her that is put away from her husband committeth adultery. This is his example. This is not a disjointed, like suddenly when he's talking about adultery. He's been talking about this whole ministry. What he's talking about is things that are esteemed among men and things that are abominable to God. That's what he's talking about. The fact that men think one thing is right, God thinks another thing is right. And they're disconnected. And everyone's trying to push their way into God's kingdom having their stuff. Like God's kingdom is like the way I say. I'm going to drag, here's all my doctrine. We got the Bible, but then we got my doctrines. I don't know why I love to shake paper at the screen. I got my doctrines. I guess because that's, even one piece is good enough, right? My doctrines. It's usually not one piece. My doctrines are the truth, of course. You see, it is in Jesus' time. People, the Pharisees taught, they had a teaching. This is now about the Pharisees' teaching. They taught, well, if a man basically, divorce was 100% justifiable, or there was no sin. And Jesus is saying, divorce on some fundamental level is it is no justification for what is essentially adultery. You know what I mean? The law made a provision for divorce, but that doesn't mean that divorce is justified. There can be justified cases for divorce. No doubt. Christians are called to actually not divorce, not intentionally divorce, but to try to work things out. But if you're married to an unbeliever and they want to go, you are not obligated to keep them from going. I also have often pointed out, though, you're not allowed either to try to, muck up the relationship so that they want to leave. Yeah, I mean that's the kind of, again, it's technically legal. No good. So divorce technically was permitted in the Old Testament. But the Pharisees believed you could divorce for any reason you wanted. So let's say you are married to a woman. You've been married for 20 years, right? She's had a few babies. She's kind of put on some weight. She's got a few wrinkles now. But then you see a woman 10 years younger, and she still looks pretty good. And you think, and maybe you coworker or something, right? It's coworker. You think, I think I'd rather be married to her. So you divorce your wife, and you marry her. Well, the Pharisees' argument was that's perfectly justified. That's perfectly righteous because you followed the law. If you follow the law, you're righteous. That's what the law does. It makes you righteous. That's what they believed. It's wrong. What he said, Jesus' argument is that's adultery, in spite of your divorce, because from the beginning, the intent, you're married to a woman, and you're looking at another woman, and you're lusting after, and you want to be married to her. You know what I mean? The reason is you want that other woman. And that's adultery. It will be, adultery was like divorce. I can't think of a lot of good reasons to divorce, quite honestly. But God, according to Jesus, he gave it for the hardness of your hearts. One good reason for divorce is to keep one spouse from killing the other. All right? You know what I mean? Like, because people, if they can't divorce, if you listen, I used to listen to old-time radio. In 1950s and 40s, old-time radio was filled with murder stories of husbands and wives who would not grant the other divorce, so they murder them. And I have no doubt that is a motivation, or was a motivation for murders and divorces. You know, I mean, people who couldn't get a divorce, no, I'll never give you a divorce. And it's like, so they murder them. I'm not saying that happened tons in reality, but it was the plot of all those things, so it must have been something that came up. So the easing of divorce restrictions has been unfortunate for the family, but also it's better than murder. Definitely. You know? No one should suffer themselves to be killed either. I mean, if someone who fears for their safety should leave. I don't necessarily think that they should instantly run off and get divorced, but it's like, I'm not a marriage counselor, and so don't take my advice as if I was. I'm just saying, right and wrong, divorce should be a very rare remedy for very big problems. I mean, rare remedy for big problems. And it's never a right thing. There's always sin involved. Somebody sinned. That's why there's a divorce. I mean, sorry, I'm going to sniffle suddenly. So what he's saying is divorce is fundamentally adultery. This is just one example of the way the Pharisees would have their idea of what's right and wrong. And this would be confounded with, or conflated, which means to, one time I thought I invented a word conflute, but actually I meant conflate. Conflate, which means to have two things. Conflute actually is would be a good word. It sort of exists because I coined it. But conflated already exists, so it means to have things, you get two things confused with each other, right? The law of God, or what's esteemed by God and what's esteemed by man. People get confused. Oh, God, it's okay. And then he goes right into this parable. It's important. All that ground I laid is so important for understanding this parable, because just like the last parable, the events in this parable, like most parables, are fictional, but they are also totally untrue. There's no basis in reality in this parable. This parable is not based on any real thing that happens in God's kingdom. It's the opposite. Just like the last parable, it's a representation of what is highly esteemed to man and not to God. And if you know the law and the prophets, you know this is also true. Unfortunately, though, and this is what makes it complicated, because they're not paying attention to what Jesus is saying. All this very, very, you see how he's carefully making this case. And then he goes right in this parable. What is highly esteemed among men is abomination to God. And your divorce laws are false. And your other doctrines are false too. I'm going to start off because of their covetousness. Or in the middle of it, they were covetous and they derided him because they didn't like his parable. But his point is like, you esteem one thing, God esteems another. There was a certain rich man. But before we go into it, it's the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. in which Lazarus, this character, is seen in Abraham's bosom. And there's all this. And Christians will quote from this passage as if this is gospel. And it's in the gospel, but it's not gospel. Just like the unjust steward. Do not go thou and do likewise. And in this thing, the Pharisees taught that divorce was okay. Right? Don't go to and do likewise. And don't go and teach this either. Don't go and teach things that are false. Do not go and teach that Lazarus and the rich man is true. It's not true. Just like the parable of the unjust steward. It's not something you should follow. There's to be learned here, but it's not something that's true. Just like giving a woman it's not justified to get a divorce, and this parable is not true. There was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen. Well, there's a truth to it, by the way. But I mean, what I mean is the material facts of the parable is what is esteemed to men. Let me put it that way. That the story here is a story esteemed by men, and I can prove it because men still teach it as though it's true. But it is, once again, this story is an example of something men have shoehorned into the truth. They have shoehorned their view about the world and their view of what's right and what we'd like things to be, how we want the world to be, how we want the things to work, how we want death to work. We shoehorn it in. We push it in, squish it in. But it's not part of the truth. In fact, before I go, and if, again, my problem is in my throat. Here's the thing. If you ever, you might be offended by some of the things I'm saying, and I would like you to entertain the thought and keep listening, because even if you don't agree, you're going to hear something a little different, and it's something you ought to be able to account for, and maybe you could explain to me why I'm wrong. Everyone basically has said, people point at this passage or some other passage and say, what about this passage? What about that passage? But nobody ever goes into the passages that I say that make it necessary. See, I'm not just saying, reading this, it's not going to be obvious why it's wrong. I did a major work years ago, which probably should be updated with a little more additional material. It was one of the first things I wrote on my not first, but it's one of the older things that's on my website. Remember we showed you the website before. Down here at the bottom. And this is the studies page. You just click on studies at the top. And then go down to the bottom. On the left side. I believe in death and in the resurrection of the dead. I forgot if this is it goes to the HTML. Did I read that? Yeah, there is a listen to this. There's a single audio file. The reason I did it like that because it's long. It's only 4 hours, and I read it for you. It's not a whatchamacallit, like this is major table of contents. You can go through all this stuff. It's nearly a book, not quite. Well, it's a small book, right? I guess I wrote a book, sort of. I never think of it as a book. It's a web page. So I probably should go back and rewrite it and turn it into a book or something. But anyways, there's audio. You can listen to it. It's long. But if you look here, you can see all the arguments. I go through all the difficulties. On the right-hand side, you can't quite see it. It means all the objections people are going to have, the difficult passages. There's one that's not there, as someone brought up to me. I'm like, oh, okay, I forgot about it. I didn't realize. I never thought of it because it's very minor. But most of it's there. And so it certainly didn't change my mind having one more passage. And I was like, that doesn't change a thing. So I suggest listen to this or read it, whichever you prefer. Or look at the sections you find, like if you have a particular thing in mind, like, well, what about this? Look at that. But hear me out, because Jesus' point, I'm in context, walking lockstep with the thoughts of the Lord. What has he been focused on? Heaven? No, he's been focused on what people think about getting to heaven. And also, this parable does double duty. Because it's going to deal with, one, the things people think, the things people do on the world, not to get to heaven, but the things in the world men pursue, which will not benefit them in the world to come. That part's true. Because Jesus taught that constantly. But also, that the things they believe about what's coming are wrong. There was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. Now this is a parable. Sometimes people think, oh, it wasn't a parable. There was a certain rich man. Verse 1 of the chapter 16. Oop, went too far. Oh, no, Paul. The slider. It's because it's so small. All right, there we go. Verse 1. There was a certain rich man which had a steward, and blah, 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 blah. The last parable started with, there was a certain rich man. It's a common preamble. There was a certain do-do-do-do, and that's the signal that a parable has begun. Right? He was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. What a great life he had. Every day was just a party. Sumptuous, soft clothes, good food. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which had laid at his gates full of sores. Now, Lazarus is a contraction of the name Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron, who was the true high priest. And Mary said the law and the prophets. And so I think there's some connection there. I'm not sure what it is. I'm just mentioning that in passing because it's like that's part of what you see going on is a thought process happening in real time, oftentimes. Because it's like, I'm always trying to develop the argument better. I know what I think about things, but I want to develop it better or maybe find something deeper. So let's see. A certain beggar named Lazarus, which laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fall of the rich man's table. And desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from... Oh, there's a comma. Okay. So he lay there full of sores, desiring to be fed with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And besides all this, between us there is this great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us which would come from thence. Then he said, I pray therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that they may testify unto them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went to them from the dead, they will believe. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rose from the dead. Now there's a double irony here. You have to understand that everything Jesus says in this parable, they believe. So you have to get it. What don't the idea of Lazarus going back from the dead to preach to his brethren. What does that signify? Like, who needs to hear this message? Well, the men who would wind up in torment, right? They have Moses and the prophets. We know he's talking to the Pharisees. He wants them to go back and do what? Tell them about the place of torment, right? The irony is, the Pharisees already believe all this. They already believe all of this. In fact, everything in this parable is the Pharisees' doctrine. It comes right out of the Pharisees, the writings concerning the Pharisees. Now, for me, this has always been a touchy point because I don't have firsthand knowledge of the writings of the Pharisees, but in the Companion Bible, it says from the works of one Lightfoot that, and I don't know if that was translations of Josephus or Philo or whatever or something. I don't know, but and I should research this more thoroughly, and because over the years my understanding of the biblical aspect of this has been honed to a fine, sharp point. So I understand the biblical side of it. I really want to brush up my historical side. Okay, but I believe, and take it for what it's worth, according to ancient writings, which I have, this is so lame. This part of the argument is so lame, because contextually it's obvious they believe this. You know what I mean? But it is lame to argue like from historical sources. But it would, let's see. Maybe you want to hear the exact reference? I'm not sure who wrote it or what, right? But let's get it. This is the book in question. All right, let's see. Luke 16. I just want to read the part about where it is, because I'm not. Why should I summarize when I can read it right out of here? I'll read you from the notes. Okay. Oh, the Talmud. Like, for example, Abraham's bosom. According to the notes in my Bible here. The Pharisees taught that there were 3 sets of angels for wicked men. That's the angels. And others for good men. The Pharisees taught that there were 3 places you went after you die. Abraham's bosom, under the throne of glory, and the Garden of Eden, that is paradise. Speaking of death, they would say, this day he sits in Abraham's bosom, and the citation given is Lightfoot, Works, Volume 7, pages 159 through 63. And again, and there's other notes made of the things said here. The Pharisees gave long stories about imaginary conversations between people in hell and in Abraham's bosom, and people could be coupled and stuff like that. The Pharisees taught that in life 2 may be coupled together, and one sees the other after death, and conversations take place. The Pharisees gave long stories of similarly imaginary conversations or discourses. All right, so my point. They already believe all this. And so the point is obviously then about they won't believe if one go from the dead. But what is it he wants them to believe? You know what I mean? Is it all this rigmarole about all the traditions they believe about, when you die, the angels carry you away? This is not a Christian teaching. Now, some Christians teach it, but it's not. It's not the way we teach it. There are so many scriptures that are like, we rise from, we rise from the dead. We believe in the resurrection. One of the things that always had a problem with me is, like I said, when I would read Revelation 20 and the sea giving up the dead which were in it, it was always weird to me. I'm like, Well, I thought after you died you went to heaven. That's what the Pharisees taught. That's what a lot of people teach today traditionally. But here's the thing. You can shoehorn that into the Bible. You can shoehorn it in. But it's an awfully tight fit. And it's not really right. It's not right. It's in there because it's something that is a subject dealt with. And what I mean is the Pharisees believed it. People always, death is a little mysterious, and what happens afterwards, people always want to make conclusive statements about it, And the Pharisees' doctrine is a representation of that. Now, what's the double irony is, as I was reading it, was so obvious to me, it's like because they already believe all these things. They believe after they die, they go to a place of either Abraham's bosom or torment. But what they don't believe is they're going to Abraham's bosom. Why? Because they follow the law. And you got to go back to what did Jesus say? If you put away your wife, you're committing adultery. You're not going to make it. You're not going to inherit all the fiction. One, the things you believe are fiction. Two, you're not going to enter into these everlasting habitations you think you're going to enter into. Like in the parable previously of the unjust steward. The unjust steward thought, they'll receive me in everlasting habitations. That works among men, but not with God. And you can talk all you like about going into Abraham's bosom with men, and you may even get a lot of people to agree with you. And they'll say, Paul Strangini's wrong. And fine. But I'm telling you, it ain't going to work with God. It's not going to be there. There is no Abraham's bosom. This is the only place in the Bible it's ever mentioned. The story on the face of it is ridiculous fiction. It is. It's not the way the Bible teaches these things. Now, you don't have to agree with me. Quite frankly, you don't have to agree. And it may sour your view of me immediately. Some people, that's like the number one thing. People otherwise might really like to listen to me teach, but this is often the thing that really, even for family members, close family members don't like this. And you gotta understand, I grew up believing the traditional view. I didn't willingly come to this. I had a friend tell me recently how he really liked my, I believe in death and the resurrection of the dead. He thought it was quite excellent. But I remember him bringing me the notes from the Companion Bible, which is the work of E.W. Bullinger, who's an ultra-dispensationalist, I know, but I don't agree with him on that. But a lot of the research is sound. I don't agree with him on everything, and you don't have to, but the point is, the truth is the truth. I remember him bringing that to me and me being like, oh, well, what about what about the thief on the cross? Okay, what about the thief on the cross? We could talk. I addressed that in my work. This day you will be with me in paradise. It's not the only interpretation to say oh, you're going to heaven right now. It's not the only interpretation. And not only that, what about the 20 other scriptures that teach that when we die, we go into the ground? And then the next thing that happens is we're raised from the dead. You got to be raised from the dead. That's what happens next. You die and then the resurrection. There's no intervening time for you. The dead don't experience the passage of time. So from the perspective of one who dies, the resurrection is instantaneous. You know what I mean? It's like one moment you were alive, and the next moment you're alive again. So there's no but we have to put it in a way that makes us feel, no, right now, while I'm alive, what's going on? It's a selfish, self-centered view of reality. This is not the right view. The view of reality is that, he died, and I was washing the dishes. But while I was washing the dishes, angels were carrying him away. And then while I was taking out the garbage, he was sitting in Abraham's bosom, and Abraham was twiddling his hair. Abraham was tickling his chin. Why the hell has Abraham got to be saddled with this duty? Everyone's got to, what is he, Santa Claus? Everyone's got to sit on his lap? And if it seems irreverent, it's not. It's only because it's not Jesus' teaching. What he's saying is, You believe all this garbage, right? And it's funny because you think like, okay, that's what people say. Like, if you take away hell, people won't believe. They're gonna, you need hell so you can preach the good news. You know what I mean? So if there's no fear of eternal torment, they won't repent. And Jesus' argument is, look, at right is right and wrong is wrong. That which is highly esteemed among men is abomination before God. If you won't listen to the law and the prophets about right and wrong, and you know what's right, you know what's wrong, you know that this is adultery. And and this is all made up. You know how I know Lazarus and the rich man is... You know how I know Lazarus and the rich man is made up? Because it doesn't come from the Old Testament. It's not there. Let me see if my phone's on. My regular phone's on, so if someone was trying to that's just my landline. I got one. And there goes the voicemail. Okay, you know I know it's not true. Lazarus and the rich man is not true because it's not, the law and the prophets don't contain it. The law and the prophets teach what I teach. The Old Testament teaching on death is, there's no Abraham's bosom and such nonsense. That is a tradition of the Pharisees. It's not just something Jesus made up. If Jesus made it up, I'd believe it. It's something they made up. Men believe one thing. They believe all these fictions about the afterlife and stuff. And sometimes I think it's funny because people think that's what's going to get us to heaven. They say, Paul, you're in danger of hell because you don't believe in hell properly. Or you're in danger of hell because you don't believe that after you die, you go to heaven. You know what I mean? You're teaching the wrong things. I teach what's right. You know what I mean? And the things that commend you to God are righteousness, holiness. God, doctrine is important, but it is, the doctrine is I used to be very strict about heresy, and I still am, at least with myself. I won't allow myself to just be like, well, it's just a little heresy, but I don't. But, some doctrines are less important than others, and also, I trust that if I can't make a brother see, then I need to pray for God to give him eyes, or to give eyes to me, because maybe I'm the one who's blind. You know what I mean? Maybe I'm the one who's blind, then pray for me. But the rich man died and was buried. He lifted his eyes, being in torment, seeth them Abraham far off in Lazarus' bosom. Have mercy on me. I want to get to the meat of the parable. In your life, you received good things. The Pharisees had another teaching. Remember Jesus talked about the Tower of Siloam falling on people, or the Galileans whom Pilate mingled their blood with their sacrifices. Right? Do you think they were greater sinners? But I say to you, you will and likewise perish except you repent. His disciples once asked him, who sinned that this man was born blind? The Pharisees would look at this beggar and say, obviously a sinner, look at him. God has cursed him. He's covered in sores. But the rich man, you're so blessed. People use this on me too. Because I'm not rich. You know what I mean? I'm not... A lot of people say I'm not rich, but from my perspective, they are rich. I have neighbors who say, well, we're not rich. I'm like, dude, you're rich. I'm not going to say it to his face because I don't want to argue with people about stuff like that. But it's like, from my perspective, you're rich. Now, I know me, compared to some people in the world, I'm rich. Everyone in America is rich. They think we're all rich. We're not. A lot of us, even us with a lot more money than I have, like someone making maybe 3 times what I make, very often is still living paycheck to paycheck and consuming everything they make because they live more extravagantly. Part of what makes my life so rich is because I live simply, so I have enough to live. But the riches of my life are in my family life and my relationships and stuff, and in all the works I get to do. And I find myself rich just for the privilege of sitting here every morning and doing this Bible study. To me, I like it. I remember waking up thinking I wake up. I hate waking up, but once I get down here, I love doing my Bible study. I do. I love doing it. It feels good. Every morning I feel like I'm doing a task that I not only can do, but I enjoy doing. And there's no like heaviness. I enjoy it thoroughly. That's not what I was getting at. Oh. Yeah. But in life, they would look at someone like and say, oh, they're so blessed because they have so much money. You know, there are things that are esteemed among men. Not just money, but maybe children, maybe whatever. You say, well, you're so blessed. But that's not where the true blessing is. You know? And he's saying, now it's not that because, now here's the thing. Don't think reading this that it means that there's automatically a reversal of fortunes. That because people who didn't receive much, like if you had a bad life on the earth, you'll have a good outcome in heaven and vice versa. He's saying this is the truth for you. In your lifetime, you received good things and he received evil things. But now it's reversed. He's not saying that's like, oh, it's going to always, first will be last and last first. Certainly, there is a big reversal of things. People who are in the earth despised become exalted. You know what I mean? Truths that are rejected are found to be true. In fact, that's almost the way I look at the interpretation there of it. It's like, that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination before God. You know, when they were in the earth, the doctrine. Here's my interpretation of the parable. We're going to go a little bit longer here. Here's my interpretation of the parable. In the world, right? The doctrine that said, hey, you can divorce your wife for any reason and go marry a younger woman. That doctrine lived sumptuously. Very popular. Very popular. Very popular doctrine. But then the law of God goes like a beggar. Lazarus is a Talmudic contraction of the name Eleazar. Lazarus goes a beggar. The law goes begging. You know? It's not esteemed among men. Notice that send Lazarus back. If one come from the dead, the law of prophets were until John, and now the kingdom of heaven is preached. The kingdom of heaven was preached by who? The one who would rise from the dead. The one who would rise from the dead is Jesus. Though one return from the dead, they will not believe him. He is the one that believes from the dead. The law and the prophets preached. Lazarus is a picture of the law and the prophets. Men did not esteem the law and the prophets, but esteemed rather the doctrines of the Pharisees. You can get any divorce you like. Men did it their way. They shoehorned everything in, and they want to push. They want to push into they want to press their way into the kingdom of God, bringing all their doctrines with them. And to some degree, it's been successful, right? Men still do it to this day. But when God's kingdom comes, the law of God is going to be in first place. And the things which were esteemed of men are going to have no place. And here's the thing. That which is highly esteemed among men is abomination before God is what is meant in this parable. That line connects the tissue between the previous parable, the line about adultery, and this parable. They are completely connected. A lot of people don't understand the connection between them. It's important to mind that they are totally connected. This great gulf is another one of the Pharisees' ideas that there's this gulf of separation. But I'm just, it sucks because I'm really just getting into it. I may go back over this tomorrow because it's a big enough thing to go at it twice. I may not take up the whole study with it, but because we're out of time and because it's just worth it. And I'm just getting into gear. I'm just seeing like what I want to say. Well, because like I said, it is a parable about false doctrine. They won't hear the law and the prophets. You know, the whole time Lazarus is sitting there and they see the injustice of it. You know, right? There's something about the five brethren too. Let them hear. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just look over what I have. We've pretty much covered it. I will probably do a brief recap tomorrow and bring in any more ideas. I'm going to look at the notes I have and make sure I didn't miss anything important. I don't want to give it short shrift. Certainly, my teaching, I believe in death and resurrection. I go over at length certain subjects. I don't know if I covered this quite as well as I maybe did today, or maybe I covered it better in some aspects. It is difficult to go into something and say, look, you got to understand this is someone else's teaching, but it's in the mouth of the Lord. But the point of the parable is the reversal of fortunes. The Pharisees esteem their doctrine above the doctrine of God. In this world, the Pharisees' doctrine is esteemed higher. Everyone loves the idea of you die and go to heaven. Now go to Revelation 20 and tell me how it makes sense with that. Tell me how it makes sense with Revelation 20. Where, you know, with the idea of the first resurrection, the final judgment, I couldn't make a timeline out of it because it requires a timeline, because what you're doing is you're demanding that it happen in time, meaning in the time of earth. Like while I'm washing the dishes, the angels are carrying him away to heaven. Ow, ow, ow. And while I'm doing the laundry, it's funny, I'm mentioning things I never do. While I'm doing the laundry, I'm just saying, like, things are going on, business as usual on the earth. I'm taking out the garbage. Another thing I never do. I have 8 kids, right? You know that, right? So that means no more taking out the garbage for me. Not for a while. While he's taking out the garbage, you know, he's saying, "Oh, Abraham, how nice to meet you in your bosom. Can I cuddle up with you? I'm going to cuddle with Abraham. How weird." You know what I mean? Because obviously the idea of Abraham's bosom is, even to the Pharisees, a metaphor. It's a metaphor. And so the idea of the rich man talking to Abraham, and is that really what heaven's like? Is that what Revelation paint a picture like that? Tossed in the lake of fire? Whatever. I suggest that study, and tomorrow we will probably touch, I'm certainly going to touch on it before we move on to chapter 17. Yeah, okay. So anyways, thanks for joining me in this study. I look forward to being back again tomorrow and continuing our study of Luke.